let's jump into things. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Hope you all had a great Easter and had a nice break. Today's webinar has got two presentations. We've got Michael Werrey presenting the FENZ GIS response to Tangoio Fire, and we've got John Gibson talking about sea level rise mapping and river flood mapping in the Wellington region. Once again, I'm Ted Taylor. I'm Sales Events Coordinator at Eagle Technology, and I'm going to be the host and MC for today's presentation. I'm also joined online today by Greg Price from Eagle and Carly Johnson from the New Zealand Esri users group. So thanks for joining us for the second session of our user presentations, carrying on from Scott Samble's presentation and GBS's presentation last week and our tech update the following week. Hopefully you were able to join us for those, and if not, you can always view those webinars online, which I'll get to in a minute. So before we get into things, I'll just go over a few items so you know how to take part. As an audience member, you'll be muted during the webinar today, but you'll be able to ask questions by typing into the discussion panel as shown here. You can send these questions in at any time during the presentation, and we'll collect these and address these during the Q&A session at the end. It will also be helpful if you can, since we've got two presenters, if you can make note of who your question's being asked to, and we'll assign those appropriately. We'll try to get through as many as we can within the time, but if we don't get to your question, don't worry, we'll pass these questions on to the presenters at the end, and they can look to get in touch with you. And if you have any questions for us or just general questions, you can email through to gistraining@eagle.co.nz. With other things. So today's webinar is scheduled to run for about an hour. If you need to jump off at any point, that's totally fine, as the session will be recorded. Afterwards, you'll receive a follow-up notification with the link to the webinar and the other webinars from the series. And if you know of any colleagues who are unable to join us, they can also access the recordings online as well. So moving on, I'll now pass over to Michael from Hastings District Council for his presentation. So take it away, Michael.
Cool, can you see my screen, Ted?
Yep, you're all good.
Okay, thank you, Ted. Morning, everyone from the sunny Hawke's Bay. My name is Michael Werrey, and I am the Senior GIS Analyst at the Hastings District Council. I have experience with the rural fire sector from when Hastings District Council was the Rural Fire Authority prior to establishment of the Fire and Emergency New Zealand organisation back in July 2017. I was also deployed to Pigeon Valley in February 2019, both as a firefighter and as the GIS specialist, alongside the fire behaviour analysts. I'll give a brief overview of the GIS response to the Tangoio forest fire north of Napier back in January, where I worked with FENZ Senior GIS Analyst Craig McAlpine in creating online and printed maps. Some of the tools we used were created as a response to the Pigeon Valley fire in Nelson, which Patrick de Jong from Interpine outlined in his presentation at the Esri user conference last year. As with most emergency responses, there were issues around communication and access to data, but overall there were plenty of learnings for the future. Some background on the fire. The Tangoio fire started approximately 11:40 AM on Monday the 6th of January. It started in cutover or slash caused by recent tree felling in a forestry block off Tangoio Settlement Road, which is about 20 minutes drive north of Napier. There were forestry operations occurring around the time of ignition. The main issue was the strong westerly winds, which pushed the fire into 5 to 7-year-old pine and a stand of mature trees approximately 20 years old. After this, the fire spread into a 1 to 2-year-old forestry block managed by PanPac, which caused separate issues due to forestry owner politics. 6 helicopters, 1 fixed-wing plane, and up to 20 crews were fighting the fire at the height of the operation. The fire ended up burning 400 hectares, and it was the biggest fire in Hawke's Bay for 30 years. Several fires broke out around the same time on the 6th of January in the Hawke's Bay region, from Mohaka in the north down to Porongaho in the south. These fires, which with the strong winds, threatened to spread out of control, putting pressure on local FENZ resources. In addition to this, there were a few medical and motor vehicle related emergencies for firefighters to contend with throughout the same day. The on-call FENZ National Incident Management Team for the week starting on the 6th of January was Team Mitchell. Team Mitchell was headed by Trevor Mitchell, who was previously the Principal Rural Fire Officer at the Hastings District Council. I am part of this Incident Management Team, or IMT. Trevor activated the IMT mid-afternoon, and with most of his team being from outside of the region, they started arriving from late afternoon. Most of the team mainly from Wellington and Taranaki. The decision was made quite early to utilise the recently renovated Sedum building in Hastings. The team was in action until Friday the 10th, when the decision was made to stand down the team. Fortunately, I had Craig McAlpine come up to Hastings, so it was good to learn from him over the week. Craig is used to the urban side of fire operations more than rural. And one key difference with urban and rural operations is that urban deal with short-term events, for example, house fires, car crashes, and cats stuck up trees. Rural events can be long-term events, and most of the GIS work is helping the IMT create incident action plans that look 24 to 48 hours ahead. As with most incidents, getting the information back to the Emergency Operations Centre in Hastings was difficult. My first map lacks detail, and all of the data shown here is only an estimation. One difficulty was knowing where the cutover area was, or where the 1 to 2 year old pine was. And the only imagery I had was the 2014-2015 rural imagery. As you'll see later, my initial map is a fair way off from the actual perimeter. Now in the past, rural fire was managed by councils and forestry companies. The Pigeon Valley fire in February last year was the first major rural fire under FENZ management, and it was quickly identified that there were areas to improve on within the GIS space. This resulted in the standard print template for incident action plans, which I received after creating the first few maps for this event. There is now a rural fire project in ArcGIS Pro and a story map template in ArcGIS Online. On a side note, the printing at Pigeon Valley ended up costing around $50,000, and this can be avoided going forward with the use of ArcGIS Online. The forestry companies pre-FENZ had more resources than the councils, especially Interpine based out of Rotorua. Interpine have a number of drones with infrared cameras and access to recent satellite imagery. By 10 p.m. on the 6th, Patrick and Dave Harries from Interpine had supplied a satellite image to Craig and I. The image was taken on the 28th of December, and it gave us more context of where the fire is. We can see the forestry roads clearly in the image, and we can see there is vegetation in the northeast area, which was grassland back in the 2014-2015 image. The cutover area is the lighter colour to the south, so we now knew where the approximate point of ignition was. The map here was the one used for the 7 a.m. briefing on the 7th of February up at the fireground. On the second day, I created a map with the forestry roads, which was very helpful as these were often used as references from the fireground. Often the report from the fireground will say Baines Road or Wiggins Road, but as these are forestry roads, we as a local authority don't have a clue where they are. The forestry company provided a PDF map of their forest, which I geo-referenced into ArcGIS Pro. Patrick and Dave also provided a full satellite image of the entire fire ground and the surrounding area. This was a vital base for maps going forward, and we thank the guys for making that available to us. Over the night of the 7th and 8th, FENZ drones equipped with infrared cameras captured hotspots around the perimeter. This allows us to have the most accurate picture of the fire perimeter, so we can see the differences in a couple areas between the estimation, the purple line, and the actual perimeter. A tool used by forestry companies is FireMapper, which I've used only briefly. FireMapper was used by the operations managers at Tangoio and is an app that is available on iOS and Android. The data for this event was sourced from ArcGIS Online. Points can be added quickly into FireMapper and shared very easily, and photos can be taken and linked from the application. There is a photo point to the northwest of the fire perimeter in this map. And here is the photo from that point with some of the key data that is attached to the photo, like date, time, latitude, longitude, and the direction that the photo was taken. FireMapper also has the ability to display real-time tracking of the fire trucks and helicopters. Patrick mentioned FireMapper at the conference last year, and his employer, Interpine, and specifically Dave Harries, have been the leader of FireMapper throughout New Zealand. Going forward, the management of FireMapper could be changed to FENZ, which will allow easier access during an incident event. This is the FENZ template, which will be used as a standard for future incidents. These are being used for printing at large scale for the 7 AM briefings on the fire ground. After getting the drone data into ArcGIS Pro at around 5:30 AM, I fortunately had access to Hastings District Council's large-scale plotter to get these printed at A0 size. I printed these at around 6 AM to allow enough time for them to be driven out to the fire ground. This is the most detailed map we created, and it shows structures, water source points, fire breaks, drone hotspots, and the sectors to help the fire operations. The template will be a backup, as ideally we'd want ArcGIS Online to be accessed, but this depends on reliable internet connectivity. The connectivity at Tangoio, which is only 20 kilometers from Napier, was a hit and miss for the majority of the event. The data was uploaded into ArcGIS Online, and we did get the FENZ New Zealand Situational Awareness story map to load onto the FENZ command vehicle out at Tangoio in a test. And the tab in the screenshot was the new tab that we created for this fire event. I also created a 3D scene of the fire ground using ArcGIS Pro. We can see the undulating terrain that made up the topography of the fire ground. With the poor internet connectivity, this would not have been usable at the command vehicle, but I did have the scene displayed on one of the projector screens in the operations center. And a 3D scene could be a valuable tool at future incidents. What worked well? Firstly, the Tangoio event was the first event in anger in the new Emergency Operations Centre in Hastings. Most of the things worked well, and having the on-site IT support from Teresa Simcox from the Hawke's Bay Civil Defence Group was an additional assurance to have. This was different to the Pigeon Valley response, where the IMT was set up in the Tasman District Council chambers. The use of ArcGIS Online in conjunction with FireMapper for IMT meetings and for operations on the fire ground was a success for a first test, and this can be built on for the future. For me, access to the Hastings District Council GIS data and to our large-scale plotter assisted with my role in the response. As well, local knowledge with the incident controller and within the GIS team helped everyone from outside of the region, but this is not always going to be the case at future events. There were a few learnings from the Tangoio event that was noted by Craig and I, and this has been shared with the other GIS professionals that are part of other IMTs. ArcGIS Pro and ArcGIS Online are definitely the best method going forward. Reliable internet connectivity at the command vehicle is a must, and it was a bit hit and miss at Tangoio. However, having the ArcGIS Online map available for the morning briefings at the command vehicle will save time and effort at future events. Prints should ideally be used as a backup only. As with other events, the permissions to shared drives and web maps were fixed during the event. Shared access through FENZ OneDrive or Microsoft Teams for storing files, and permissions/access to web maps, web apps, and ArcGIS Online need to be finalized prior to an event. A GIS map of all forestry roads would assist with initial reports from the fire ground, and this would be needed for the entire country. This would assist any GIS response to fires in or around forestry blocks. There were no workflows or standards for GIS during a fire event, and Craig is drafting workflow processes and sharing templates as a result of his learnings. A nice to have would be a GIS professional to work with the FENZ drone operators in the future to get the most out of the data. At the moment, the FENZ drone operators are trained more specifically around urban search and rescue rather than rural fires. Looking to the future, the size and intensity of vegetation fires are increasing every year, like what happened in Australia over the 2019-2020 summer. Last estimate I saw was 18 million hectares was burnt in Australia during this time, which is larger than the entire South Island. The same increase in size and intensity could be seen in New Zealand, but on a smaller scale, as much of our topography is immune to extreme fire conditions. Even today in mid-April, many regions throughout New Zealand remain in prohibited or restricted fire seasons. More fires are expected in and around summer, and GIS will play a key role in the response. Overall, it was a successful week, other than having a TV camera focusing closely on you. Fortunately, this didn't make the final cut to the 6 p.m. news that night. Thank you for listening, and I'll hand it back to Ted.
Thanks very much, Michael. That was a great presentation. Just a reminder for you guys in the audience out there, if you have any questions for Michael, please send them through now and during the next presentation, and we'll get to these at the end during our Q&A. I'll now hand over to John Gibson to take us through sea level rise and flood mapping in Wellington. Okay, John, I'll hand over to you. Great, that looks good.
Good.
Oh, there we go. Yep.
Good. Good morning, everybody. My name is John Gibson, and I'm with Greater Wellington Regional Council. Today, we're talking about hazards, and I'll be moving from the extreme of fires that have been that Michael's been talking about to extremes of flooding. What I'll be talking about is use of GIS mapping tools provided to the public on the topics of river flood risk and sea level rise in the region. So as background, the Wellington region is the area shown in the top right of the slide here. So basically, it's the area south of Otaki on State Highway 1 and south of Mount Bruce on State Highway 2. The region's got about 8,000 square kilometers and a population of about 500,000. Now, Wellington is well known for its windiness and its susceptibility to earthquake hazards. However, the region's also very susceptible to river flood risks and also to sea level rise risks. Up till about 2017, there were no full regional compilations of data on flood hazard or sea level rise hazard. On the topic of river flood mapping, there's been no national coordination to date that I'm aware of. In contrast, there's been good national coordination on sea level rise risks, but there's no agency has attempted national sea level rise mapping on a standardized basis yet. Now, that's in contrast to the situation in Australia, United States, and some European countries, where the entire coast of the country is covered by interactive sea level rise hazard bureaus. Recent reports from ICC and elsewhere suggest that the threat of both river flooding and sea level rise is getting worse, and there's a quote there on the right that's taken from a recent report. So in terms of our regional coverage, what is GWRC doing about this, and how can we better inform the public through our mapping services? Back in 2016, we were displaying some flood hazard layers in our hazards web viewer, and this is covering the topic of river flooding first. You can see on the right an image of our older Flex viewer for hazards, and we had individual flood hazard layers for various floodplain areas, which were all named. There were a few problems with this, in that you had to basically choose the area of interest. There were inconsistent classifications, and we only had partial regional coverages. Also, there were no linkages from those layers back to the parent reports about the hazards. Basically, the layers were tucked away, hidden within the hazard viewer, and not easy or prominent in terms of accessibility. So how did we move forward from that situation? Well, the first step, we reviewed all the available public examples we could find of flood hazard maps internationally. I was quite surprised in that report that there was very little standardization. Many of the data presentations were really quite technical and not suitable for general public use, or certainly not easy to use for the public. And also with things like symbolization, there was very little standardization. One positive we did find, there are some really excellent examples of presentation techniques. The image on the left there is extracted from an Esri Australia website, which covers flood hazards in Brisbane. And I thought that was a particularly good example of what's possible in terms of flood mapping presentation. So following that review, we worked with our flood engineers on standardizing and reclassifying available flood data sets, so we had a consistent set of data. We used 4 main classifications based on annual exceedance probability, or AEP, and these were explained in a linked table of descriptions from the site data. So after flood engineers had unified all the river flood data into one GIS data set, we linked the features from GIS to web pages in our flood management plans, and also linked to a page giving flood hazard explanations. It was presented using a Esri web application viewer. There was minor customization, quite simple to use with no layers. It's also mobile friendly. And the style we adopted was from a similar hazards viewer produced by Waimakariri DC. It was launched in 2017, and we had good consistent usage stats from our community. We integrate additional data as it arises. Community consultation has caused revision in some areas, as well as new surveys that we've undertaken. And we've also noticed some minor differences from district plans for historical reasons, because district plans come produced on a different timeline. And we've also expanded our classifications for areas under revision, which I wasn't too comfortable with, as I quite like the simple early classification we started with, but of course we have to deal with data as it arises. So I'll move on from river flooding to sea level rise issues. Sea level rise is obviously now a regular headline issue. There's a clipping there on the right from Stuff in 2018, suggesting that a Lower Hutt suburb in the region could be swallowed up by sea level within the next 80 years. The first national overview assessment of sea level rise was done by NIWA for the Parliamentary Commissioner of the Environment in 2015. That was Jan Wright in the office at the time. And we looked around, and by that time, public web viewers for sea level rise were quite well established in various countries around the world. And typically, these involve slider controls, allowing interactive changes to the model sea level rise. So how did we go about doing some work on sea level rise in the region? Firstly, we were fortunate in that we were beneficiaries of regional LiDAR coverages back in 2013 that came from a local government consortium study, and that gave us very good modeling of the coastal margins in terms of elevation. That data was passed to NIWA in 2015 for their work for the Parliamentary Commissioner, and in return we got the analysed data of sea level rise hazard zones in about 2016, 2017. That covers coastal elevation from 0 to 3 meters above high spring tide mark. We put that into our public viewer, our flex viewer again, and called it coastal elevation. And you can see an image that shows modeled inundation of the Lower Hutt area up to 3 meters above high spring tide. Moving on to 2018, GWRC had become more active in the climate change space, and we wanted to provide a dedicated sea level rise viewer. So as with the river flooding, we made a review of international examples and best practice. And we aimed to merge the best practice that we'd find with existing standards from the 2015 New Zealand study data. We chose to reanalyze data for an expanded range of 0 to 5 meters and also use a finer increment of 20 centimeter intervals to allow us to visualize that using a slider widget. Otherwise, we use the same standards as in the 2015 study. We're also able to access improved LiDAR, which had been reprocessed on behalf of WINS in 2016. The image here shows the web viewer that we used to display the resulting data. There is a toggle button on the left-hand side, which allows the viewer to toggle between sea level rise under calm sea conditions against storm surge, which combines the effect of sea level rise with storm surge, which is what happens when low atmospheric pressure and onshore winds cause abnormally high tides to occur along the coast. The storm surge data that we had been earlier commissioned from NIWA as part of a separate study for part of our populated coastal zones, and that was done using hydrodynamic modeling. The viewer itself uses the Esri API for Leaflet, Bootstrap, and jQuery, and it incorporates a vertical slider widget which comes from the Bootstrap library. So in this slide, I touch on some of the techniques we used in our sea level rise model. Sea level rise model surfaces in GIS essentially use offsets from an elevation surface, but a number of adjustments have to be applied to ordinary topographic DEMs before we can get an easy-to-use set of sea level rise model surfaces. I've outlined these in diagrams below. So imagine that the diagrams with the lines are effectively cross-sections through various surfaces, and I've included the jargon about tides, which is necessary to understand how sea level rise is modeled. We have two different approaches. You can see them in the diagram on the right there. Basically, if we talk about sea level rise in calm sea conditions, we just deal with the level rise up to high tide. If we talk about storm surge, we have to add an additional factor on top of normal high tides, and that comes in two components, basically the storm tide and the wave setup and run up. So storm surge will obviously, in all cases, give higher levels of flooding associated with any given value of sea level rise. So starting with the calm sea conditions illustrated on the lower left there, we start with a standard digital elevation model, or DEM. Most DEMs in New Zealand use as a vertical datum either the local vertical datum, typically one established in the 1950s, or more recent data will be established relative to the New Zealand vertical datum 2016, which was obviously fairly recent national standards. In Wellington, we use a Wellington datum 1953 as a local vertical datum. When it was established, it was approximately at mean sea level, but since that time, 60 odd years in between, the sea has risen about 20 centimeters. So the datum is now below mean sea level. In contrast, NZVD 16 in the region is slightly above it. The datum that we're really interested in to establish a baseline for sea level rise is the high spring tide. In this case, the term mean high water springs 10 is used. Mean high water springs 10 is the mean high spring tide, but it's taking the top 10% of values. So it's effectively the highest value you'd expect the tide to rise in calm sea conditions. This is a datum really established by NIWA in their work, both for the Parliamentary Commission in 2015 and also subsequently. Note the high spring tides vary in height around the coast, so this implies a variable offset from the established topographic DEMs. What I did in this case, I used NIWA data available from their reports to create an interpolated surface of offset values to convert the topographic DEM to a DEM using the mean high water springs 10 datum. And from there, it was only necessary to add constant factors for sea level rise. For storm surge on the right-hand side, slightly more complicated. We had our data provided by NIWA as a result of hydrodynamic modeling, but NIWA have also very recently this year published papers showing how this may be modeled in all situations around the New Zealand coast using a set of equations. And this gives what they call extreme sea level 100, basically the highest storm tide you'd expect in a 100-year event, storm surge event, so also referred to as a 1% AEP storm. So those factors have to be added on to the existing data, as well as obviously the sea level rise values. So talking about the outcomes of the sea level rise viewer, we launched that in mid-2019. As I said, we included both storm surge models as well as sea level rise models for static or calm seas. Quite a lot of negotiation was required before launch, but it's generally received a positive outcome and we get good usage metrics. Gert van Maren of Esri has assisted by developing some 3D web viewers of key urban areas in the region which are threatened by sea level rise. This image here shows an Esri ArcGIS web viewer showing potential sea level rise impact in Lower Hutt. It can go down to 3D building level, and it also incorporates a dashboard which summarizes potential losses, both monetary and in terms of number of buildings and roads that are flooded. So in summary, The river flood map site is now well established and under routine maintenance. There is a great deal of activity nationally in the sea level rise space, and recent reports that NIWA prepared for the Deep South Science Challenge in August 2019, and also a paper prepared in February this year, outline new models both for river flooding and sea level rise nationally, and that's where the storm surge data models that I referred to are outlined. DWRC issued a coastal vulnerability report in July 2019 in conjunction with sea level rise mapping, and we also launched a blog launched by our climate scientists to help gather citizen science observations about sea level rise. Thank you. Last thing I want to do after the presentation is just show you a brief demonstration of the sea level rise viewer. So here we see the web viewer, which is available to the public, and it's showing how the slider works in illustrating sea level rise under calm sea conditions. The color indicates the depth of water that will be attained. So the redder colors are those which are inundated first and become most deeply inundated. We also include an indicator of likely sea level rise values according to IPCC and other sources, looking forward to 2100. And here in the viewer, I've moved to the area around Wellington Airport, and you can see the vulnerability of particularly State Highway 1 as it approaches Wellington Airport around the Rongotai area. Also the susceptibility of the area that was just shown in Miramar. And this is flipping over to the storm surge data, and it shows the result of hydrodynamic models. These are limited to the range 0 to 1.5 meter sea level rise. Also showing that we attempted to have some story map type features in providing contextual information. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, John. We'll now move into the Q&A part of today's webinar. One sec. Okay. Greg, do you want to start us off with any questions you have for Michael?
Would help if I unmuted myself. Hi, Michael. I thought that was a really interesting presentation. I hadn't heard too much about that fire, so it was great to get that overview. I was just wondering, have you been involved in the Hawke's Bay COVID response, and was there any learnings from dealing with the fire response that was sort of brought through or into the COVID response?
Good question. I've only been real briefly on the side of the COVID response, but I would say there hasn't been many learnings from that, but just because of the situation being unique down at the Civil Defence Centre. I think they've only got 6 or 8 people in the building, so the communication's all done remotely. So a lot of the learnings from Tangoio, where you could have the meeting face to face, everyone's seen the same picture right there. Yeah, it's just been hard to bring over to this event, I believe.
Okay, and just one other question was, how do you see, or how would you envisage that the internet issues, you know, to the command vehicle would, you know, might be addressed?
I guess it's looking at getting a receiver like on top of the machine or on top of the command vehicle that has got reliable internet connectivity, or even if it needs to be through satellite internet connectivity, because yeah, Tangoio is not that far from Napier, so whether we've got real poor cell coverage in Hawke's Bay, or it's just, I'm just thinking other ones are going to be in more remote areas, and it's probably needs to be something of I don't know, urgency, but high on the list for FENZ to add to their command vehicle is something that's got good connectivity back to a central point.
Maybe a satellite backhaul or something or other.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
I've got another question for you, Michael. Those crazy printing costs you mentioned, do you reckon that's a pain point across many organisations in terms of those paper maps that you have to churn out?
Yeah.
Oh, I've lost you there, Michael.
I can't hear him either.
Oh, there it is. Sorry, we lost you there, Michael. Okay. Sorry, Michael, we might need to check the connection on your side. I've got a question for you in the meantime, John, if hopefully you can hear me. So you mentioned there's no national coordination on the river flood mapping. How do you see that progressing? Are there overseas models that will look to emulate moving forward, do you think?
That's an interesting one. I'm not aware of any countries that have a completely nationally coordinated flood mapping system. And I certainly, when we did a review back in 2017, we couldn't really find any really good standout examples that we could kind of follow on from. So I do believe that there's quite a way to go in terms of any kind of national standardization. Yeah, it's an interesting topic, but I was quite surprised by just how diverse all the different presentations of flood data were.
So just a follow-on question to that one, John. So does that mean both the categorization of floods, of the flooding, plus also the symbology, there isn't a national, standard or similar, and symbology it's different for everyone? Everyone just kind of...
That appears to be the case. We looked at all the councils up and down the country as well as overseas and didn't find much example of commonality. Interestingly, the NIWA report that was issued in late last year in 2019 did propose a basis for national flood modeling, but I don't think that touched on anything to do with symbolization or presentation issues.
Another question, I just might jump in there, Ted. There's looking at some of the modelling that you guys have been doing there, has that actually been used in anger, so to speak, with respect to an actual flood emergency to provide an indication to those responding what the likely damage would be and the extent of the flooding might be?
I think we've been fortunate since the launch of that site that I can't recall any particularly extensive flood event in the region. The data is common to all of our flood mapping information, so I would expect it to be used, and it should form a useful guideline in the event of a emergency flooding event.
All right. And those apps that you saw, that I guess that you showed right at the end there, they look pretty interesting. Would you be open to sharing those with other regional councils?
Oh, absolutely. The code has been put on GitHub, and anybody is very welcome to reuse that. The presentation techniques are very similar to those used in other applications. I think the examples from the United States were often the sort of reference for that kind of viewer, but they all use different software under the hood.
Okay, excellent. So people can go and get them from GitHub. That's awesome. Back to you, Ted.
Cheers. There's a few questions here from Michael. Michael, you can turn on your microphone again. Hopefully we've got sound on your end. Michael, are you there? Okay, unfortunately we seem to have lost Michael. Those of you that have asked questions for Michael directly, we can pass those on to him to answer and get back to you. Unfortunately, yeah, we can't ask them live at the moment. But there is another question here for John. How much does the SLR mapping and modelling rely on high resolution topographic and bathymetric data?
There's some very good commentary in reports by NIWA on the necessity for high resolution topographic data. Most of the populated coastlines of New Zealand either now have LiDAR-based topographic DEMS, or those DEMS are in the process of being commissioned and captured. So we're quite well covered there. Those areas that don't have LiDAR topographic coverage are forced to use something like an 8-meter DEM, which would come from sources like satellite radar, or from even the 20-meter contour mapping from LINS. So they're not particularly useful when it comes to the sea level rise mapping. It only gives quite a general indication for coastal zone if you don't have LiDAR data. There's also the question mentions bathymetric data. I assume that bathymetric data is useful for proper hydrodynamic modeling of storm surge effects, but the latest NIWA papers show ways of modeling storm surge using general principles that don't require bathymetric data. So yeah, high resolution, in a nutshell, high resolution topographic data fairly essential, bathymetric data less so.
Okay, thanks very much for that, John. Let me just check, see if there's any other questions. Michael, if you can get working on your sound, hopefully we'll get you back online in a second.
Can you hear me now?
Ah, there we go, Michael, you're back.
Yeah, I'm not sure what happened there.
Well, that's all good. We can move on to some questions for you now. Here's one for you. Did you use the Prometheus fire prediction software to model the fire spread?
Not with this one. I did do some modeling post-event just to see how it aligned with the conditions on the day, but the data that I had was based on the old vegetation, so it sort of had the grassland area to the northeast of the fire, whereas now it's that 1 to 2 year old young pine, so a different type of fuel there. So my results didn't come out as good as I wanted to, but down the track, if I get time, I might have a look at the modeling.
Okay, it's good to know. Here's another question for you. You mentioned the forestry company supplied a PDF map which you georeferenced. Should there be a standardized format for supply of this information, or do you have a preference for this?
Yeah, I know forestry companies are a bit sensitive about supplying the data. I'd prefer to have it as a GIS file, shape file, whatever. I've had issues with them supplying data for other projects, so I just knew grabbing the PDF was just going to be the quickest way to get the data into the system. It's not the most ideal way, but because I wasn't getting super accurate, I just wanted the center lines of or close enough center line to the forestry roads. I just thought it was just going to be the quickest method for this case, but yeah, preferred a GIS file going forward.
Yeah. I suppose it's also a timely thing as well. You want to get those maps produced as quick as possible. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the drone hotspot data information, was this transferred from the drone operators, or was it the georeferenced images or CSV files of points of interest?
They provided KML files, which then we added into the ArcGIS Pro software. But that we're good. We've if we can get a GIS professional, maybe they out there when they're flying it, and we can see if there's a better way where it can be just automated from the drone, because you've got to have a tablet associated with it. So maybe we could get it almost live data back to the operations center. So that's just something to learn down the track if it's possible.
Yeah, that's good to know. And I think this is the last question I've got at the moment for you, Michael. So
Cool.
you mentioned the real-time tracking of the fire appliances into FireMapper. How is this achieved?
I've only heard it that it's possible. I didn't see it in action. So I know the fire service vehicles have got a system called ALPS, which is their automated location system. So Craig is over this quite quite a lot down in FENZ headquarters. So I haven't seen how it would be done, whether it's through a REST service or some sort of live service that we can just directly plug into FireMapper. Yeah, I haven't seen it in action, so but it'd be cool. Especially the helicopters. I would like to see them flying around.
Yeah,
the map would be quite cool.
Definitely. It's something to look into moving forward, and hopefully we'll see some developments there too.
Yep.
Okay. So last call here for any more questions. If anyone wants to ask anything, now's a great time, or otherwise you can always email us afterwards. Okay. Oh, yep. Here's one that's just come through. Hi, John. Great presentation. Is there any activity in your area to capture building floor height information to assist with actual building flood impacts? We've found mobile laser scanning in this space to be very useful.
I'm aware that some councils, for example, Pororoa City along the Pororoa stream, have captured building floor height information, and I'm loosely aware that that is quite useful, but I don't think we have regional coverage on that data. Yeah, it might be something that we should look into to improve our coverage.
Okay. Okay, guys. I think that is all our questions for today. So, so that will conclude our Q&A session. If you've had to jump off at any point during this webinar, you can check the link here on GoToStage and watch the recordings of this webinar. And our next webinar takes place on Friday, the 17th of April at 11. So please visit the Eagle website here, that top link, and register for that if you haven't already done so. And following on from this webinar, you'll be emailed the link to access this recording. So a massive thanks to all of today's presenters, to John Gibson and Michael Werrey, and also to Greg and Carly for being on the call. These VUCs are a collaboration between the Esri user group and their partners Eagle, GBS, and Alterra. And the user group would also like to say a very big thank you to those sponsors who are also part of the VUCs. We've got National Map, GeoWorks, Jacob, and First Name. So thanks very much, everyone, for your time. Stay safe out there, and we look forward to seeing you online this Friday and connecting with you face-to-face as soon as possible. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.